in this time of endings, which both you and your work, and I certainly with what we do at Dark Mountain Project, we're looking at this age of endings. So it's not simply just an individual death that we're dying that we have to consider. It's also, we are in this whole territory, it's kind of bardo, if you like, of a whole way of life. And how, for you, does story work within that, when we live in such a superficial kind of story of, progress or getting stuff and being a certain kind of person? What kind of story works for you in this kind of moment of awakening?
I don't think there are such things as superficial stories, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
I think if they're stories, they have a consequence and profundity. I think what you're referring to by superficial might be better characterized as sloganeering and advertising and politicking and diatribing, none of which they can't even approach the throne of story. The thing I love about story more than I even am aware of most often is how utterly incapable it is of argument. It has no skin in the game in that sense. It has no, it doesn't have a horse that it's pushing. A story is so beautifully, seamlessly capable of an affirmation of life without needing a foil or an enemy or even an adversary. It's simply life. Stories and life recognize each other very readily, I think, and they don't mistake each other for, a bad thing, a hard time, a kind of darkness, and so forth. And I learned that I was lucky enough to apprentice to a storyteller when I was a kid. For 7 or 8 years, performed with them all over the States and Canada, and I saw the real thing in action, which is terrifying, because the standard for your understanding of what your life should be is scored and scoured and seared for all time. Really, that's what happened to me. So I'm not saying that I'm up to the task necessarily, all that frequently, but his example as a storyteller eclipsed his example as a human being. So I was very lucky. And of course, in those days, when he used the term storyteller, I thought it was the lamest self-description I could imagine. It just sounded like a children's entertainer, which is a real ghetto in entertainment land, no matter what people might think by that reference. And I've come to realize how gigantic was his capacity to occupy the moment that was entrusted to him, all of which is borne along by storytelling. So with that in mind, I suppose I trust the instinct for stories. It is not an amazing thing. It seems to me that when people argue, one of the first casualties of a prolonged argument is the cause of the argument. Isn't it true? I mean, not just romantically, but certainly there too, that you can't remember why anymore, because the fact of argument is more important than the cause or the whatever prompted it in the first place. Stories are never forgotten, really. It's not to say that everybody remembers incrementally how they all proceeded, no, and that there's not necessarily a revised standard version of every story or even every good one. But the amazingly forgiving thing about stories is if you enter into it as a teller or a participant, as a hearer, you don't know where the beginning is, but that becomes the beginning. And the story starts to tell itself by virtue of your willingness to engage it yet again. You can't remember arguments, but there's something about the human mind that is itself a storied thing, I think. And it tells itself and uses you to do so. And you recognize something of your soul's craft when you're in the presence of a good storyteller. And envy is the least of your your inducements, I think, when that happens. So I'm nowhere near answering your question, but I prompted for the first time in a long time. Somebody's talked to me about story in and of itself, and it's so unwilling to be drawn into contentiousness and argument. And these days, in particular, you could easily make the case that storytelling might be more needed now than any science, pseudoscience, retroscience, or anything that uses it as a catapult, to throw stuff around.
Is that because it's speaking to a different part of ourselves, do you feel? I mean, I think when I've listened to certain storytellers, certainly ones that feel like they're getting to the depth of the bones, of the ancestral bones of myth underneath, the this and this and this and this happened. There's this other thing, this other sort of kiva that's happening underneath. I certainly think that they resonate more deeply with us than, as you say, the argument, or even when I say superficial stories, I meant they're sort of like hero and princess stories where we're all doing really well and it's happy ever after. Like not necessarily those stories, but those ones that can help us go down and deal with the situation we're in.
Yeah, I don't think those princess and the likes that you mentioned there. I honestly, not to be argumentative here with you about it, but I honestly don't think those are stories. They're too reducible. They lend themselves too much to the Aesop's fabling kind of. It turns into a moral. It turns into a cautionary tale. But that's not what stories do. The amazing thing about stories is how they amplify ambivalence. That's their principal MO, I think. Mm-hmm. And that's the fundamental service they lend to us, is that they craft in us something like a higher regard for ambivalence than argument or slogan tends to tolerate. I mean, when you listen to politicians, they're nothing but ambivalent. They're nothing but lost in what they're talking about. But their lostness is lost to them, because they're embroiled in contentiousness, right? And pseudo debate and the rest. And it has to be an awful life, I have to say, with very little sympathy, but still, it has to be an awful life to be, especially in a time like the last 2 years, where you have to represent some kind of, here's what we're doing and we're going to get through this and everything will be fine. And it's beyond a lie, So there's something similar about the unwillingness to acknowledge the kind of prismatic consequences of living deeply engaged, responsible in the literal sense of that term. That stories give you a way of expressing, but also a way of encountering. So much more often than not, we're on the receiving end of what story does, and occasionally on the practice end.
Right.
Right. So the old adage is the best way to get a good storyteller going is for you to begin to tell a story badly.
I'll start then. So when you say, I just kind of just want to ask you about the story we're talking about. I mean, I might ask you for an example if that would be all right. Because there's a lot of talk now. I mean, a lot of people say to us, "Oh, we want a new story," or "We want to control the narrative," or "We want a new narrative." And I'm going, but those are not the kind of stories you're talking about, are you? No. You're talking about a very particular kind of story. And do you have an example of such a story that might speak to these troubled times, or the one that you've lived your life by, or struck you particularly in your apprenticeship, for example?
Yeah. I would characterize the ones you're talking about rather than give you a particular example, and say,
perfect.
Probably what they all seem to have in common to me is the absence of the voice of authority, which used to be characterized as the God voice. More recently is the narrator voice, and I think in the contemporary sense, it's probably the contentious, disbelieving, disquieting voice. The amazing thing about the clamoring after so-called new stories is that it seems to me that the people who are making the case that such a thing is needed can't make the story. They can only make the case. See? Now, if you see that clearly, that's the beginnings of a story. That whole strange dynamic, the double speak and the misspeak and the entire alienated understanding of what the gift of speech is for. The gift of being able to hear speech is for. It's not to win. It's so that life becomes recognizable to us and that everything human ceases to be foreign. That's what they're for. And if we can manage to approach the throne of humanity that way, humanness that way, then everything in the world that's not human tends to benefit. That has no need of being human tends to benefit, I think.
That's really interesting. I mean, I was thinking about one of the stories that has always spoken to me. And partly you do go back to your childhood in a moment, because that's when you first listen and when you first really lean in and go, okay, so something amazing is happening here, because you just know it, right? Kids know that. And it was always fairy stories. I mean, partly it's because I'm from Europe that those stories still speak. But coming to this thing of authority, what always struck me was that sort of being kind and being discerning and allowing help to come in the form of not just other humans, not very rarely other humans, actually, it's usually animals, isn't it? Or the trees, or the spirits, or something. That openness and that working with the fabric of life is very strong in fairy story, and indeed in myth. But what happens is, as you get older, some of these stories that we listen to are not really in that territory, not in that earth territory. They move, don't they? And how do we get back to being able to listen, in the sense of round the fire with our animal ears, to that story that speaks to that, our creaturehood and our imagination?
Yeah, I'd be hesitant about characterizing the project as reacquiring in some fashion or going back to.
Right.
And the reason I have hesitation about it, it says I am not persuaded that every generation that's currently alive today had its glorious intact period.
Yeah.
To somehow, yearn after and reacquire. I'm not persuaded that this is true. I don't think our dilemmas are a decade deep, or a half century deep at all. So that's the first caveat. So a story is first and foremost an engaged memory, not a remembrance, but an actual unfolding memory. And you mentioned around the fire. Well, we just did this night before last. It was about minus 20 or 25, and we have a few kids living on the farm, young kids, and they're old enough now to be able to sit there without bitching and griping too much for a while in the cold. And somebody asked me to tell a story that I told years ago in something I did called the haiku sessions, which is a story about lostness. And it has a refrain, which good stories tend to have. And the refrain goes something like this: I'm not telling you this story so that you can make sure that this doesn't happen. I'm telling you the story so when it does happen, you'll remember that I told you. Okay, now why is that refrain so important, not just in that story and in that setting to those kids, but I think across the board? Because you want to know in your bones, no matter how radically unique you imagine yourself to be, that you're not the first one at the cliff edge of your trouble. You want to know that. You want to know that the path you inadvertently followed was made by somebody who came before you, right? That's what the word catastrophe literally means. A catastrophe, kata is the Greek preposition indicating descent and entry, down and in. And strophe, this is a old term which meant something that was braided or assembled or somehow organized to become something which in its disparate parts it was not. If you put the two things back together, a catastrophe is a way of going down into the mystery days that was somehow made by those who came before you, who you do not meet in your descent, but you meet somehow the precedence of their descent in yours.
Mhm.
And beyond comforting, there's something else going on there. It says this is actually necessity masquerading as deep misfortune. It's a kind of necessity. You come to it differently when you're willing to see it that way, that it's not all bad, that it's deeply unwelcome, and the timing couldn't be worse. But for all of that, the beautiful thing about this is your descent into the mystery days tends not to be your idea.
You're not in control. That's
Well,
for sure.
beyond that, you have the opportunity to experience the I would call it the prevalence of life over your instincts for self-determination. North Americans have basically exported self-determination to the world as the principle, the primordial sequence that you should be obeying and exercising. It's something that we should be in almost permanent plea for forgiveness for, and mysteriously, it's got a lot of takers in the rest of the world. Right?
There's quite a bit of that in England too, actually.
Yeah. Well, no doubt. But we are what happened to you when you left. You see, and there's an immense story in there. When you were talking about fairies and fairy stories and so forth, I was going to say to you, you may or may not know this, but from the sort of primordial memory point of view, a European is a fairy to a North American. It's a strange notion, no?
But yeah, it's a very strange notion. I quite like it, though.
I think it's true.
We're not talking across the dimensions then.
Yes, you see, because there's something about you that's older than we are, and this is discernible to us. And to put it in a melancholic fashion, many's a time when the old days when you used to be able to travel, you may remember those days.
Oh God, I did, yeah. Long gone.
And I taught very frequently in Europe, Australia, and other places. And I would say, particularly in Europe, I would say, do you ever think of us? Apropos of nothing in particular, do you ever think of us? We are what happened to you. We are what you became when you ceased being what you've now grown accustomed to. Do you ever think of us? Because we come from you. And almost universally, no one would even answer the question. They wouldn't even make eye contact with me because we all knew what the answer was. The answer was no. And I would stop and I would say, now, ask me whether we think of you. And the answer is all the time, voluntarily and otherwise. But that's true. So there's some storyness even there, no, which is in human history, it's recent years I'm talking about, 300-400 or so years. But the notion that we are what you became is, I mean, for me even to say it aloud to you right now, does something biochemical to me. It sets up a field of a kind of longing that has no desire in it. A longing to be more recognized than recognizing for once. Because you must appreciate that anybody who looks like me here in North America, we are truly and forever strangers in a strange land.